Well, y'all, we got a really exciting talking about union stuff. We got a really exciting conversation coming up for y'all with Nick Bowlin, who is an absolute must read and must follow. He has a piece in The Guardian. You can find the link in the show notes to it about the trials and struggles that these people in Denver had in this union campaign. He wrote it before the final tally was in. This was recorded on Monday, but yesterday, and let me share this with y'all. Yesterday afternoon, we got the results. I guess we got two, but we got the results here that the group in the Denver Starbucks voted unanimously to form a union with Starbucks Workers United. Here's the photograph of those brave folks celebrating. It's a hell of a story. Nick really paints a very compelling picture as to the struggles that these folks were facing. And we also talk a little bit about Colorado's hidden labor history. So I hope you all enjoy, and we'll see you all on the other side. We've got a few more segments after that, too. Welcome back, Left Reckoners. David here, joined as always by our good friend Matt Leck.
Hello there.
And we're joined again by a return guest, Nick Bowlin, who is a reporter with High Country News. You should definitely check out the interview we did with him just a few weeks ago about why Democrats are losing rural America. But we wanted to bring him on today to talk about something very specific to Colorado that is also touching on this big national story. And that is this Starbucks union campaign. He has a great piece that y'all should check out in The Guardian called Pure Propaganda Inside Starbucks Anti-Union Tactics. And we're really thrilled to have him on to sort of break down this piece. Thank you so much, Nick, for hanging out with us this afternoon.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Well, totally, man. Well, let's just jump right into it. We're going to talk a little bit about Starbucks, and then towards the end, we're actually going to hear a little bit about Colorado and the area's labor history, which will be really interesting. But before we get there, we're talking about a campaign in Denver. And for people who might not be familiar with what's been going on the ground, particularly for like working people, what's the kind of state of play right now for the average person in Denver, Colorado?
So, yeah, in Denver over the past decade or so, cost of living has just skyrocketed, with most of that increase based with housing costs. There's been Denver's economy is really driven by these kind of like big, fast moving economic forces like aerospace and tech and finance. But for the sort of person who makes most of their income or all of their income from Starbucks, it's just really hard to live in Denver these days. And, this is kind of the context in which my story took place, is that, these workers who've worked at Starbucks for years, and in some cases when they began, they could live fairly comfortably. They can't anymore, and that this was an impetus for them to think about unionizing when the kind of nationwide Starbucks union push began back in December.
Yeah, and I mean, this is like why this story is both particular and sort of universal at this point, where like so many people who work for a wage are really struggling to be able to continue to, support themselves while also providing very, very necessary services for their community. This location is pretty interesting, and it's a pretty interesting location. They call it the Barn, if I recall correctly. It's
That's
a really
right.
fascinating building. When Matt comes back on, we'll put up an image of it. But could you talk a little bit too, in addition to the housing crisis? What were some of the conditions particular to this Starbucks in particular that sort of were encouraging people to unionize, and what was really behind the drive for this union campaign?
Sure. So the barn, and yeah, when you pull it up, it really does look like a barn. It's on, if you know Denver, it's one of the kind of the more famous main drags in Denver. It's called Colfax Avenue, and it's got a lot of the kind of iconic Denver restaurants and music venues, old theaters, that kind of thing. And, the workers there say that, and this is a thing for Starbucks baristas, there tend to be a lot of Starbucks in close proximity to one another, and it's common for workers at one location to share shifts at others
Mm.
if people need help. But the barn's kind of notorious in Denver because the pace is really fast. The It kind of has a reputation which the workers describe to me as not really necessarily earned, like overblown a little bit, as this kind of like rough and tumble Starbucks. So like a lot of
Mhm.
the suburban locations, Starbucks look like the baristas from there tend to not really pick up shifts at the barn. But one of the things that this does is it creates like a very tight knit group
Mm.
of employees. And they do have to deal with a lot of stuff. I think this is pretty universal across the service industry, but people have been pretty nasty during the pandemic times. One of the guys I interviewed for the story was punched by a customer because of a mask mandate thing. And another one of the kind of main characters in my story, she was pepper sprayed in the face in the drive-through window
Jesus.
by a customer who was mad that they were out of frappuccinos. Sounded like I talked to her, and they sounded like the follow-up there was perhaps some sort of mental health crisis going on there. But yeah, I mean, they've really been through it, and they say that by and large the Starbucks management, they haven't been helpful or receptive to concerns about safety. And so again, the first Starbucks to unionize was in Buffalo in December. And when that happened, I mean, they said there was just this kind of outpouring of, in the staff group chat, just like, what could a union do for us? Like, would be able to bargain for some of these protections that, or workplace safety stuff that management wouldn't give us, or increased wages, which, have stagnated in recent years and have gone towards corporate profits rather than towards the
Mhm.
baristas. And yeah, I mean, I think that the tight knit nature of the barn really contributed to them announcing a union drive pretty early, because there were a lot of them who were supportive of the union and others who weren't, but were able to kind of like be brought along by their coworkers. So yeah, they announced in January, which it took a very long time for the NLRB to give them a vote, but they announced very early on. And I
Mm.
think some of that has to be chalked up to the kind of specifics of that workplace.
Yeah, I mean, it just is. I just wanted to note really quick that like in like the complete defunding of like public space that we're seeing in cities, it's like Starbuckses and like those kind of places end up being very important for the community, and these people are having to do multiple roles at once, like one providing a service and coffee, and also maintaining an environment for people of many different walks of life, people who have different needs, etc. And one
Absolutely.
of the things that was like notable, I think, in your piece, and you've touched on it already, but like, is that there's a demand. Obviously, like we want better pay, we want better security for ourselves, we want better benefits, all that kind of stuff. But there's also these secondary. They're not secondary, but like they're attached to it demands. Like we need the company to also be showing up and supporting us and supporting the workers if we're going to be doing this kind of work that is sort of necessary for maintaining our jobs right now.
Absolutely. And, Starbucks has been around for decades now. They're, I think, 9,000 stores in the US. And, it's been a target, or at least not, maybe not even a target, but union organizers have been interested in making inroads there for years and years. And one of the reasons they haven't been able to is because Starbucks tended to have pretty good benefits
Mm.
and pay pretty well. Um, I think, one of the reasons why you're now, in addition to some other things like pay hasn't really kept up, it used to be better than it is relative to inflation. That the pandemic and the working conditions and the fact that, people who serve coffee had to go to work every day while others, got to work from home. I think that really did kind of broaden the
Mhm.
possibilities for labor organizing and start accelerated them maybe in a way that kind of, yeah, I mean, 6 months ago, there were 0 Starbucks unionized in the
Mhm.
US. And now I think there are more than 60 successful campaigns and like almost 300 ongoing. And I mean, the just awful conditions that they had to endure during the pandemic, I think really contributed to that.
And the pepper spray incident, that this part like captures so much of what's going wrong in America. So you have this mental health crisis, which underpaid workers are on the front lines of dealing with at all these major corporations. It's not these union busting management that has to deal with any people that either hate masks or have some other crisis that's not being addressed. And like you say, like what's so brave about what these people are doing is they do rely on those health benefits because we don't have those universalized throughout the country, which is partially why you have this crisis everywhere that
Exactly.
these workers have to deal with. It's such like it's a mess.
No, it really is. And, this was one of the things that, the Starbucks workers were, one of the things one of the quotes that stood out to me, it's in the story. One of the workers said, yeah, like Starbucks was one of the first American companies to give some manner of health benefits to part-time workers. It's like, that's a really good thing. That's why people seek out Starbucks often and have historically. But she said to me, like, the company doesn't get to, like, if you give us some benefits, you don't get to tell us like that's enough.
Mhm.
But the company is trying to do that. And she said, okay, well, like, then we're going to form a union and push for some more. Because yeah, I mean, like we said, they can't really live in Denver on a Starbucks salary as it stands right now, or it's really really hard to. And they're saying, yeah, I mean, we're grateful that Starbucks has better benefits than maybe some other large corporations. But rather than them being kind of like benevolently granted to us from on high, like, we want to create a union and go bargain for our own.
Mhm.
Yeah, like these major corporations, and like Amazon makes a show of like, look, we support the fight for 15 guys. Like all these corporations, these major retailers, these major corporations that employ a lot of people under a living wage, they could tomorrow make Congress extend those rights to people, extend healthcare to folks, and this, that, and the other. And they don't because they like it as a cudgel that they can just give it to dispense whatever workers aren't going to frankly unionize and are going to put up with being understaffed all the time and that are going to put up with that. You get a little bit of healthcare, nobody else.
Well, and this has been, I mean, just displayed, to a somewhat shocking extent in the past couple of weeks, because I'm sure you guys saw this, but Howard Schultz announced this like pretty robust benefit expansion to Starbucks employees. It was going to be an immediate pay raise, with then a greater pay raise coming in the fall, tiered to experience level. This was kind of shocking to me, that they don't have credit card tipping at Starbucks. You can tip in the app and you can tip cash, but people don't carry cash anymore and no one uses the app. But they're going to implement credit card tipping, which is going to really increase their wages this fall. There was other stuff about like some financial service help and other, health benefits. But Schultz said they only want to expand it for non-union stores, for employees. In this attempt to pit unionized against non-unionized employees. And probably rightfully so, the union is taking full credit for this. Like, you wouldn't have done this out of the goodwill of your heart. You're only doing this because this wildly successful union campaign has blindsided you all, and now you're, desperately trying to put a roadblock in the way. And yeah, I mean, there's a question of legality that might violate good faith bargaining laws, and discrimination laws, that you can't expand benefits to only a few of your employees. But then, yeah, there's the issue of they could have done this all along. They only did it when there's this wildfire union campaign that's sweeping the nation.
Yeah, and also, like, a lot of things can be illegal, but as we've learned time and time again, these big corporations, they have the ability to sit and wait out challenges, and they're sort of banking on that to to try to bust unions in the meantime. I mean, in addition to that, Starbucks corporate culture has their whole kind of very progressive veneer. They call everybody a partner.
Mhm.
But they're not partners enough to make their own decisions about whether they want to be in a union or not. The company is now trying to pit union versus non-union workers again against each other. And also in your story, you note that this location has seen a lot of attention from like Starbucks figures. Could you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about who's coming down there and what they're saying to the workers there?
Sure. So shortly after they announced your union push in late January, the workers there say it was pretty immediate, and I was talking to them pretty early on that figures from kind of the corporate or even kind of regional
Hmm.
Starbucks hierarchy began appearing in the store in a way that they never had before. Sometimes just kind of sitting there and watching and taking notes. Other times nitpicking them about stuff like name tags or very minor uniform stuff that they said had never been an issue in the past. Over the span of a couple days in February, every worker in that store had to do a one-on-one or two-on-one meeting with some of these corporate figures where they were kind of grilled about what they knew about the union, whether they supported the union, and there were kind of vague insinuations made about benefits. So they can never say this would violate the law.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to lose your benefits if you unionize. What they can say is we can't promise you that your benefits won't get worse, which is what many employees I interviewed at that store said they were told. And then, there were, things got worse. My story begins with this anecdote for one of the more experienced employees who was definitely a union advocate, who was grilled by this corporate investigator about taking food home at the end of shifts. And to be clear, this isn't like stealing food. This is like taking expired fruit or
Mm-hmm.
expired granola bars that would either be like, they put it in this box that sometimes goes to local food pantries, but the box doesn't always get picked up. So he's like, if I see an apple in the box that's turning brown, like either throw it away or take it home. Or like, they throw away a box of granola bars that's expired and, you grab
Mm-hmm.
some. And, he said before the union thing, my manager, the district manager, everyone knows we do this. It's maybe not like condoned, but it's never been a problem in the years he worked at Starbucks. And he had to endure this call, which I got an audio recording of him just grilling him about taking food home. So he quit that day, but he suspected it was going to justify him being pre-fired. There's this kind of thing where you're kind of one step from being fired, and several of the leading union organizers were written up after never having been disciplined in any way, and there's this gradation of punishments. So they got the most severe punishment before being fired for violations that they said were either minor or fabricated. Several of the leading union organizers did. One of them was eventually fired. Several other employees were said that they just abruptly had an issue getting enough hours, which seems kind of ridiculous, right? It's like, it seems like every business in America is short staffed right now, but they would people who were expecting 30, 40 hours a week at Starbucks suddenly find themselves struggling to get 25, 28. And like I said, I mean, Denver's expensive, and suddenly they'd find themselves behind on rent. And the workers' speculation was this is one attempt to demoralize them and get them to quit so that they could hire new employees and potentially shift the union vote. And then two, they were kind of hoping if you short staff, really busy store, there'll kind of be resentment among the staff because stuff's going poorly, drinks are being mismanaged, or orders are going unfilled, and people are kind of stop sniping at each other if everyone hates each other. I don't think that happened, but that was their guess for why those tactics. So I mean, the ones who are still there, and a few people quit. I think we're up to 8 have either been quit or fired since this whole thing began. They say it's pretty miserable working there now, in a way that it was not before the union campaign. But for a lot of them, this is their main source of income, and even if they're looking for other jobs, they have to show up to work every day.
And like this is like the national playbook for Starbucks at this point. Like this is they did this in Arizona. They did this in Memphis, where they were coming in, and it was an impossible situation to figure out what Starbucks was going to get mad at you for. They're getting mad at employees for showing up early to their shift. They were getting mad at employees for staying late. And it always seemed to happen that the people who were just getting these kind of strange violations that were atypical were people who are heavily involved in in the unionizing.
I will say that the Denver Starbucks definitely put themselves, I think, put a target on their collective backs, because they did a 6-hour strike and walkout before they formed a union, which is, I think
that's brave.
Yeah, it's brave. It was March 11th. They, walked in, said, under our NLRB rights, National Labor Relations Act, right? It's NLRA rights. Like, we are walking out. We will be back at 1 p.m. And they kind of demonstrated in front of the store. And this led to months of back and forth about Starbucks claiming about all this like violence and hitting cars with their picket signs and stuff from the workers. It was part of a complaint filed to the NLRB by Starbucks against the Denver store and against the Starbucks union, the national union. And, the workers say, like, yeah, we booed some cars who broke the picket line to go to the drive-through, but like, we weren't violent. And I wasn't actually able to drive over for that, but the Guardian had a photographer there. And, I called him when all this came out. I was like, you were there for hours. Like, did you see any of this stuff? And he's like, no, they just like chanted and booed some cars, and, some people yelled at him, and then it was over. Yeah. So it is a bit of a he said, she said, but, the workers say it's just completely fabricated. Was their description of the claims from Starbucks about what happened that day.
And there's been a few
of that, I think.
Yeah. Sorry, man.
Well, I was going to say, I think we heard similar thing was the John Deere strike, where they're always looking for an excuse to limit like picket sizes and stuff like that, and they'll like any old shit they'll make.
Alabama, same thing.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah,
I mean, they cut them down to like one person allowed to be on the picket line because of complete bogus stuff. They're not the sidetrack, but like complete bogus stuff there, including the fact that it was like the union workers themselves who were getting run over and plowed into by pickup trucks, not the union organizers causing any trouble. But they're like, so like Starbucks has filed their complaint, but the workers too have filed with the NLRB, right?
Many times. Yeah. So by my count, there are at least 4, and I think there's a couple more coming. They're called ULPs, unfair labor practice complaints, that you file with the NLRB, from this store alone. And late last week, it was announced that the NLRB is investigating over 200 instances of unfair labor practices, mostly based around some of those early campaigns in Buffalo. And my sense of it, I mean, if you go on the NLRB website, you can look at them, and it's just like several per day from Starbucks workers directed at the company. I mean, they're just pouring in from all over the country, and the NLRB's been underfunded by both administrations for decades. I just don't think they have the capacity to investigate all of these. But they have announced this huge, 200 is a lot, just pretty huge investigation of Starbucks. And that followed on the heels of a lawsuit over, I think it was like 19 instances of the Starbucks employee handbook that violated various aspects of federal labor law. So, yeah, I mean, they've been seemingly violating labor laws right and left. And the consequences are starting to come, but it's not clear what exactly this is going to do to prevent Starbucks from treating its employees this way in the short term.
let's not forget, y'all. Just going back to a conversation we had with you last time you were on, that Hillary Clinton was very seriously considering Howard Schultz to be labor secretary.
I saw that on
Yeah.
Twitter the other day, and I kind of was like, that's got to be an Onion headline, right? Like, I didn't remember that from the campaign, but it turns out to be true.
It's pretty dark stuff.
Yeah.
That is nuts. I just want to make one point about those nitpicky sort of rules, and you see this a lot in those. And there's like there's a sort of public justification for that sort of stuff. Like it's sort of like the broken windows policing. Like you take care of the small things, and the big things will fall into place. Well, the dark side of both this and the broken windows policing thing is like actually when it comes time for the authorities to get people out of there that they don't want there because they're being a problem. For one reason or another, it gets reason for them to fire them, like or jail them in the case of the broken windows police. And so, and understanding that is like this is why they decide all of a sudden to start talking about name tags or tucking in your shirts or that stuff. It's because it's time for management to flex its muscle a little bit.
Right. So that thing I told you about with the taking food home. The guy, like I said, there's an audio recording of that interaction that we were able to get our hands on. And it was, he gets really mad and he says to the Starbucks investigator, like, there's a member of staff here who's homeless. And he's like, you're like, it's going to the food pantry. Like this box is going to the food pantry. Like we literally have a staffer here who doesn't have a home. And rather than, kind of engaging with that, the Starbucks investigator starts demanding the name of the employee who's homeless, which the barista who I interviewed does not provide. But yeah, I mean, just, these tiny infractions that, the focus was on the tiny infractions rather than the fact that with a Starbucks salary, one of their employees didn't have a place to live in this city. Yeah.
Unbelievable. Well, before we go to I just wanted to ask just really quick, has there been much in the way of community support in this? We've seen different levels in different parts of the country, so I'm just curious.
Yeah, so the day of the strike, there were some other local unions that turned out and stood on the picket line. It seemed like a mixed bag that day. So there was some community support. I know the Denver DSA has been coming by and, kind of making sure to buy coffee and tip well. And I think they showed up the day of the strike too. I know that also the day of the strike, there were some people who yelled at them and crossed the picket line, and someone threw an egg at them from a nearby building.
Jesus Christ.
And then, I know that a few, just kind of, and this has been happening around the country, people come in and say, hey, we hear you're unionizing, and, put their order name as like pro union or something on the app, like little stuff like that. That has been happening. I know that one of the baristas I talked to, she said that she had some friends in the Denver teachers union, and that the teachers union turned out the day of the strike. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's been like an outpouring of either way of like positive or negative, but I've definitely heard some kind of nice little anecdotes of support.
Well, I want
to kind of jump in there because you have a little bit on the sort of Wild West and sort of versus the labor culture dichotomy. Yeah. And I'm from North Dakota, and I feel like the similar sort of thing there. The only people I knew that had were in unions was like the train engineers, like those sorts of folks. But I worked at a coffee shop in Fargo, and the thought of unionizing, like it even like at a point where I was becoming politically aware and pro-union, theoretically, I never like thought to apply it to my situation there at all. And so I'm just curious, like, just to comment on the sort of like because they cite the National Labor Relations Act when they do that strike, like that implies some sort of awareness of labor rights there. So what's like the labor culture situation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and definitely one of the reasons I got into this story. So, I mean, in terms of the labor rights stuff, I mean, the Starbucks union's an affiliate of the SEIU, one of the biggest, the largest largest service worker union in the country. So, I mean, you know, their lawyers and org doing and inform the workers of their rights. But, you know, Denver's really interesting. You know, it's a democratic city in a state that's trended blue from purple or red over the past 20 or 30 years. But, you know, the labor culture it can be kind of sparse sometimes. And the rate of unionized workers in Colorado is below that of the national average. It's a modified right to work state. So it's not a full right to work law, but it's like a half right to work law. So if it's a unionized shop and you're an employee, you do not have to join the union or pay dues, even if the union is bargaining on your behalf, or advocating for benefits on your behalf. And, you know, this is that thing about Colorado is that, you know, like you're saying, so, you know, that there are a couple exceptions, right? So there is a service worker union, the UFCW, that represents like tens of thousands of Kroger and like King Supers supermarket employees, and they did a big walkout over the winter. It was a huge strike. It was like 8,000 employees. But they go all the way back to the 1870s and something called the Amalgamated Meat Cutters. So unless it's a union from like way back in the day, the big industries in Colorado's Front Range tend not to be unionized. And this goes back to kind of the way the economy developed in this region since World War II. A lot of the mines shut down. The gold deposits had been tapped out, and there was a big silver crash in the 20s and 30s. So a lot of the mines had closed. World War II happens, and there's just, you know, like the rest of the Sun Belt, there's this huge influx of investment into the federal highway system. Military infrastructure is giant on the Front Range. And, you know, this kind of very deregulated pro-business culture develops, which is still very much kind of Denver's core economy today. And this gets tied in with what I talked to one of the UFCW directors from the grocery store union. You know, he said this is related to Denver's idea of itself as a cowboy town. You know, it's got this big rodeo every winter, and the Christmas lights don't come down until the rodeo in January. And that kind of like Western mythology, you know, rugged frontiersmen, all that stuff that, you know, is completely disconnected from the realities of settlement of the West. People, you know, whether consciously or not, it is kind of the air people breathe, you know, in Denver a lot of the time. And that is used by you know, I talked to a labor historian who said this trope is pretty common in Western employers who kind of use this to, subtly or not so subtly, getting in the way of labor organizing. And then and in the subtle sense that, you know, like unions are cultural things. Like if you know someone in a union, if your parents were in a union, you're probably going to be more to labor organizing. And if labor culture is really weak, you know, it's kind of hard to, you don't even kind of think about, you know, I talked to one of the baristas who grew up in a suburb of Denver called Golden. She was a teacher and got a job at Starbucks, to elementary school teacher, to supplement that income. And she had been a barista at Starbucks for 6 years. And so before the union thing, and she said, it kind of never even crossed my mind. Like I hadn't met any union folks in my life. And so it was this like huge mental transition for her to be like, do I sign a union card or not? And at first she was like, no, like, I don't want to be fired. I don't want to lose my benefits. And she eventually came around, but I do think that her experience was somewhat emblematic of the Colorado Front Range at large, where it's just that, like, it's not even negative towards unions. It's just like an absence of them makes it that much harder to get people who when labor just isn't part of their day to day, to say, like, I'm going to put my name on a union card, send a letter to the bosses, put my name out there, risk being fired, and stand with my coworkers. Like, that was a mental transition for her. And I think she was not the only one in that workplace who kind of had to go through some version of that.
Well, I mean, I'd just be, curious to hear you expand on this a little bit more too, because, while there is a disconnect, and there's differences in different states with their history. I mean, there is a history there in Colorado.
Yeah.
Like the Ludlow Massacre that happened there, and I mean, I want to hear about Colorado, but it reminds me like a lot of some of the stories you read about in Texas history. Well, you don't read about them in high school or anything like that. But if you're somebody like me who likes to read different history books, you're like, wow, there was a very, very radical and organized group of people in different times, from things like what you would expect, oil and gas, but also cowboys getting together, the fence cutting wars, and like there is this kind of radical history there that is just like not really a part of most people's awareness, even people who have like deep roots in these states, and might even be related to some of these people. Anyways, but I'd be curious to hear you expand a little bit more on like the Ludlow Massacre and some of that kind of forgotten history as well.
Yeah, so the Ludlow Massacre was a incident in 1913 in the southern Colorado coalfields, when there was this general strike in coal, targeting the coal company owned by the Rockefeller family. And they kind of they hired the Pinkertons and kind of famous union busting private armies, and there was an encampment of the miners and their families in this town called Ludlow, and there one day the guards employed by the mining company advanced on the camp and opened fire and ended up killing over 20 people, including like almost, I think it was like 10 children of the miners. And this sets off this, it's part of like this, I think it was almost a 2-year, on and off, they call it the Coalfields War. But it sets off like pretty literal war. This 10-day battle where, these miners who tended to go on strike about once a decade in Colorado, and is usually pretty violent. Like they were veterans of the mine wars. They start this guerrilla campaign. They destroy company towns and mining infrastructure. They fought with the state National Guard. I think there ended up being more people killed in what followed the Ludlow Massacre than actually the Ludlow Massacre itself. And it only ends when federal troops from Leavenworth, Kansas are on the train to Colorado, and so the mining unions don't have any control anymore. Like the UMWA was telling them to stop. The miners are just doing their own thing. And when federal troops are coming in, they kind of do like one more wave of destruction and then go home. And it's this huge, the consequences are kind of all over the place. Like the Rockefellers debut company unions after this, like, which are now illegal, but
they're trying to bring them back, though.
They're trying to bring it back, yeah. But this was one of the results of Ludlow. Congress does a big investigation into Ludlow with uncovering all these abuses. But then there's also a kind of anti-labor backlash. The next election, they had elect a kind of pro-business governor who was supported by businesses who kind of thought Colorado's reputation had been tarnished. And they set up this like labor commission where there are labor representatives seated on the commission, but it is ultimately controlled by the state, and the companies are well represented, and it kind of ultimately becomes a way to curb union action, especially the more militant varieties. And the Colorado unions were really strong, really well organized in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. And just, willing to like really throw down with the companies. There are kind of a few more spurts of that in the 20s. But the state basically like deindustrializes in the 20s and 30s. In part because of just like the availability of some of the minerals, and in part because of market stuff. And in part, in some ways, because of the labor unions were stomped on a little bit. And that leads to that economic transition that I mentioned after World War II, that it becomes this kind of like, representative Sunbelt hub for business and, military investment, and the radical labor history kind of gets left behind. But this one historian I talked to, he's a professor at Bucknell, who wrote a book about Rocky Mountain labor history, said that one of the interesting things is that the strike that led to Ludlow, the workers were striking for labor laws that were already on the books. like
Mm.
no script, 8-hour workday, basic workplace protections. And, a lot of the stuff that the Starbucks employees have felt like that they've been retaliated against for, are also things that are, labor action that are supposed to be protected. In both cases, the companies know that if they get risked.
Yeah, no, just, a suggestion for folks, if you haven't read Mike Davis's Prisoners of the American Dream, he has an argument in there that I just think is really strong, where a lot of people say, oh, well, why has there not been like a strong labor party in America? Or why is there labor movement not like in other countries? And like the reality is, it's not been a case of absence of it, but rather like whenever there were these big confrontations, they got crushed, and like the state gets involved and plays a massive role in trying to destroy not just the immediate negotiating circumstances, but basically tries to destroy the unions.
And then gets lost to history is when
yes.
You're mentioning that radical history in Texas. I was thinking about myself. I grew up in Oklahoma, and I remember reading this book by I'm sure you guys have heard of great indigenous scholar Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and her dad was ended up being kind of like racist white guy at the end of his life, but when he was younger was a member of the Wobblies, and she kind of writes this personal memoir about how his own personal transition as a history of Oklahoma. But I remember reading that book, and there's this thing called the Green Corn Rebellion, which is this socialist multiracial uprising against the federal government. And it's just this, between that and Ludlow and some of this other stuff, you really do kind of have to stumble across it, because you're not going to learn it in, your general school history class in elementary school. And I just remember reading that and just this is a very different picture of Oklahoma than I had. And you kind of get a little fondness for it. And then it's also sad that feels completely disconnected from reality.
But I mean, it can play a big role too in reminding folks that we're not alone, and that there's a tradition to stand
definitely
on.
Yeah, if it's happened before, it can happen again. And
exactly.
Those examples are really important.
Well, on this, before we roll, just going back to the Starbucks example, because we're not trying to pump people out, but we have to remind folks of these stakes are high. And there's been a lot of focus on the success of these run-ins. I'm sorry, the success of these these union drives. But that's just the beginning of the battle, right? And we're seeing in other places where they have won, that Starbucks is trying to play hardball when it comes to negotiating a contract.
Definitely. I mean, I think there's been a lot of excitement around the sort of people who support, the labor unions, that the Starbucks has kind of gone from 0 to 60 so quickly. And it is inspiring. I mean, the pace of this thing is really quite remarkable. But, there are thousands and thousands of Starbucks stores in the U.S., and we're at hundreds of stores with active campaigns, not even wins. We're at less than 100 wins. So every union win is significant, but in some ways that's just a really important milestone on a long process, because then you have to enter into collective bargaining. And, the way Starbucks has treated the Buffalo store, there have been continued firings of organizers. And also just that aspect you mentioned earlier of just being able to wait out people, that, they can stall and, get to an impasse in the labor negotiating process, and kind of continue pulling all sorts of anti-union tactics in the meantime, and just exhaust people, and people leave, and new people have to step in. I think the collective bargaining process is just going to be really quite brutal with Starbucks. And the SEIU, like I said, I mean, they're the giant established union. They have really good lawyers, but I think it's important to have some sense of where we're at in the process. It's definitely not, these benefits that the workers are so excited about are not here. And in some ways of thinking about it, they're not all that close. There's a lot of work ahead. There's already been potentially, I've seen stuff about the Amazon union win, and Amazon is now challenging it, and people are being fired. And just the fact that a workplace will vote to unionize does not mean that any sort of finish line has been reached.
But I mean, it's a starting point, and like this is, the advantages we have here.
Important.
Oh no, I'm not saying that you're not saying. I mean, it's like it's a starting point, and two, like this is like for the listener, people who are listening to this, like Starbucks relies on being thought of as a progressive corporation. Like that's their big thing. They've made bank off of that, and I think making sure that like we're supporting them as they're coming in, right? The early steps of unionization, and then supporting them at the negotiating table as well is really, really critical, because that's the only way that we'll be able to overcome a very powerful corporation like that, is just having constant eyes on the ground and actual support for people when they're requesting in your community, because it's a long fight, and they have every advantage, and especially in the ability to wait these things out, which just requires that we get excited and celebrate, but not get misty eyed, where we're sort of sitting back and thinking things are done before they are.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the fact that there were 0 Starbucks unionized as of November of 2021, like the excitement is certainly, and the surprise and the just the kind of pleasant air of pleasant surprise about how well this has gone is definitely warranted. But it's a very important step in a very long process, and it is in the company's interest to wait them out as long as possible, and they have the advantage in that sense when it comes to bargaining. So that's the next thing to watch.
So when this comes out, we'll hopefully have a sense of the tally. So I won't put you in the position of having to make a bold prediction, but if you could give us a sense as to, maybe what the feeling is going into, the tallying of the vote, that'd be really great. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's always a little nerve-wracking to run a story before you know the results, but, you want people to read it. I have been asking all along and, trying to interview people who weren't just unions, like, uncomplicated union supporters from day one, as many employees as I could. I didn't get to all of them. But, over and over and over, people were just, even when there were workers leaving and people getting fired, everyone just remained very confident that they had a pretty significant majority. And, towards the end of the process, when people were talking about how exhausted they were and how, the workplace had become really unpleasant, I said, is this going to impact things? And he said, the couple people said, the sense we get is that these demoralizing tactics, I mean, they've definitely made us unhappy. Like, work kind of sucks more than it used to now, but they're aware that it's the company doing it to them, not their fellow employees. Even if, you have a shitty shift and you get annoyed at, the other baristas, that the conditions that they're working in are kind of being inflicted on them from above for the union thing. So the sense that I got from, multiple people was that these tactics were probably making it only more likely that they will vote to unionize. So we'll see what happens, but that's what my reporting so far has indicated. And if I'm wrong, we'll have to do another story on what happened.
Well, Nick, it's always a pleasure having you on Left Reckoning. People can read Nick at High Country News. The piece is in The Guardian, Pure Propaganda Inside Starbucks Anti-Union Tactics. Highly suggest people read it, one for this breakdown and two for the labor history that we get there. You can find ways to follow Nick also in the show notes below. Thanks so much, brother.
Thank you. This was fun.